On Thursday, October 18th, 2001, Amy St. Laurent stood in front of her clothes closet in the small Maine town of South Berwick. She had a big meeting coming up the next week at work, and she wanted to pick out just the right outfit. Amy was an attractive 25-year-old woman with strawberry blonde hair and blue eyes who wanted to become a model. She'd even gotten some professional photos done. But when it came to her job at Pratt & Whitney, which was an aircraft engine assembly plant, she wanted to be taken seriously. And that meant dressing professionally so that people didn't get the wrong idea from her looks and youth. But as Amy tried and rejected one outfit after another, she knew that the real reason she was making such a big deal out of this was to distract herself. She was trying to avoid thinking about the man who was coming to visit her that night from Florida. Amy had recently broken up with her boyfriend after living together on and off for 5 years. She wanted to get married and have kids, but she realized that her ex, Richard Sparrow, was just not the one. She liked to travel and go to museums, and the longer she'd been with Richard, the more she realized he was just a homebody who didn't care much about any of those things. She felt like breaking up with him was the right decision, but it was still hard. But now that she had broken up with him, she was able to rediscover the joy of being single. And a few weeks ago, she'd taken a trip to Florida, and she had met a handsome 27-year-old man named Eric Rubright, who had taken her out on his motorcycle. He'd even tried to kiss her, although Amy had politely declined. Ultimately, Amy had a lot of fun with Eric, and so when Eric asked if it was possible for him to travel to Maine to visit her, she said yes. But Amy was not interested in a romantic relationship again, and she didn't want to lead Eric on. So she made it absolutely clear to him that when he visited in Maine, nothing romantic could happen between them, and he would have to sleep in the spare room. Eric said he was totally fine with that, but just in case, Amy had another safeguard planned for this visit that she didn't mention to Eric. Her ex-boyfriend, Richard, had offered to come over and hang out with them as a buffer, like a third wheel. And now, standing in her bedroom, thinking about how potentially awkward this three-way dynamic was going to be, Amy hoped she did not make a mistake in either inviting Eric or inviting Richard. That evening, Eric arrived at Amy's apartment, and right away, things got off to a bumpy start. Despite what he said, Eric did not seem thrilled about sleeping in the spare bedroom. And he was clearly annoyed that Amy's ex-boyfriend Richard was just at the house with them. And then on Friday, which was the second day of Eric's visit, Amy and Eric got into a little fight. By Saturday, October 20th, so the third day of Eric's visit, Amy was just tired of Eric's constant grumpiness and disappointment. She'd been very clear with him that she did not want a romance, so Amy decided that for the rest of the time Eric was visiting, she would just go out and do the things that she thought they both would enjoy, and you know what, if Eric didn't like it, then so be it. So Amy took Eric to Boston to go to the Museum of Fine Arts, which was one of Amy's favorite places, and then afterwards, they went out for a nice dinner. And Amy noticed Eric seemed to be having a much better time now. So, as they were driving back towards Maine, Amy asked Eric if he was up for stopping in downtown Portland, which is a city in Maine. But as soon as Eric said yes, Amy immediately began worrying that she was underdressed for a big night out on the town. She was wearing jeans, sneakers, and a sweatshirt with their company's logo on it. She considered going home to change first, but at the same time, she didn't want to dress too provocatively and give Eric the wrong message, so she decided she would just go as is. Downtown Portland is a really popular spot, especially at night. And so when Eric and Amy got there, all the restaurants and bars that lined the cobblestone streets were packed, and mostly with young people. Amy suggested they stop at a sports bar, and Eric seemed interested. But as soon as they went inside, Eric began acting all disappointed again. Amy wanted to play a game of pool, like billiards, but Eric didn't. So Amy, determined not to have a terrible night, just went and found a couple of 20-something-year-old men named Russ and Cush who she could play with. And then the three of them would play, and they would talk and laugh, while Eric just kind of awkwardly stood by, drinking a beer and looking bored. After a while, though, Amy started worrying that she was being rude to Eric. So she took him to get some pizza, and even paid for his slices herself. Then she asked if he wanted to go to a cool club called the Pavilion that was partly inside an old bank vault. Amy hoped that the Pavilion would impress Eric, but as soon as they walked in, he got that annoying bored look on his face again, and he immediately said he didn't want to dance. And at this point, Amy was just kind of over Eric, and so she left Eric standing in line for drinks while she headed for the dance floor all on her own. On Sunday afternoon, so the following day, Amy's mother, Diane Jenkins, drummed her fingers on her laptop inside of her South Portland home, trying to burn off some nervous energy. She was getting concerned about her daughter. Amy had called her mother around 10 p.m. the night before, and Diane could tell from the sound of Amy's voice that she was in good spirits. Amy had said that she and her friend Eric were driving downtown, and so she asked her mom if she wanted to join them for a drink, since she lived pretty close. But Diane was already in her pajamas, so she said no. But after that, Amy had not called again, which was odd because the mother and daughter talked every day. Diane picked up the phone again and called her daughter's cell phone, but it went to voicemail for the fourth straight time. Diane wanted to think that Amy was just busy with her weekend guest Eric, but it had been hours and hours, and Amy never ignored her calls for this long. So Diane picked up her phone again, but this time she called her ex-husband, who was Amy's father. He lived close to Amy and took care of her cat whenever Amy was away for more than a few hours. But when Amy's dad picked up, he told Diane that he hadn't heard from their daughter either. And so Diane really started to worry that something could be wrong. The next morning, when still Amy had not called her mom, Diane called Amy's work. But the person who answered the phone call said Amy hadn't shown up, and she hadn't called ahead or emailed ahead to tell anyone why she was not coming into work. At this point, Diane felt a full-blown panic attack coming on as it dawned on her that her daughter truly had disappeared. And so Diane hung up on that call and then immediately called the police to report her daughter missing. That evening, which was October 22, 2001, Detective Danny Young flopped onto the sofa and flipped on Monday Night Football. It was the veteran detective's first night off since the 9/11 terror attacks on the World Trade Center in New York. For the past 6 weeks, Young had been investigating crimes by day for the Portland Police Department, and then by night, he and his bomb-detecting dog had been doing extra patrols, checking out the Portland Ferry for explosives, or checking out suspicious packages. And so at this moment, the detective's living room couch never felt so good. So when his phone rang a few minutes later, Detective Young wasn't sure if he even wanted to answer it. But he slowly did get off the couch and he picked up, and on the other line was a deputy sheriff from the county who said he needed Detective Young's help. He told Detective Young that the daughter of one of his friends was missing after she had spent the evening with a guy from out of town. The sheriff told Young that the woman's name was Amy St. Laurent, and her mother had already filed a missing person report in Portland, and her family had already gone out and begun putting up missing person posters all over the place. But police had not launched a full-scale investigation yet because Amy was an adult and she had not been gone for very long. But this deputy was wondering if maybe Detective Young could help off the books. Detective Young wanted to say no because he was exhausted, but Amy's disappearance felt oddly personal to him. He had a daughter who was not only Amy's age, but shared the same name. And like Amy St. Laurent, Young's daughter also loved going to the Pavilion nightclub. As the deputy sheriff told Young more about Amy and why her family was so worried, Young's gut told him something was wrong here. So he told the deputy he would look into this. After the call with the deputy sheriff ended, Detective Young called a supervisor to tell him he was going to investigate this Amy St. Laurent case. But the supervisor thought this was a bad idea, that it was a waste of time. A 25-year-old woman disappearing after a night of partying was not exactly big news. Maybe she had a hangover, or maybe she met up with a guy and didn't want to come home quite yet. Ultimately, the supervisor felt like the chances that something bad had happened to Amy were pretty slim. Also, the supervisor pointed out that this was Detective Young's first night off in a really long time, and he needed to take a break. But Young was adamant that he wanted to do this, and so after some convincing, his supervisor let him launch his own unofficial investigation. Before Detective Young left his house, he called a sergeant at the police station. Since Amy's friend, who she was with the night she disappeared, Eric Rubright, was from out of town, there was a good chance he had rented a car. So Detective Young wanted the sergeant to call the local rental agencies and see if any of them had a record of Eric renting a vehicle from them. And sure enough, the sergeant quickly called Young back. Not only did the sergeant know that Eric rented a maroon GMC Envoy, but she also had another important piece of information. The car Eric rented was equipped with a GPS tracker, which meant the rental company knew the vehicle's exact location in downtown Portland. Detective Young immediately sent some officers to stake out the rental car, and within an hour, Eric showed up right around 10:30 p.m., and strangely, he wasn't surprised to see the police officers at all. He told them he'd already seen the missing person posters that Amy's family were putting up all over Portland, and he said he was concerned about Amy too. And so the officers would take Eric back to the police station to ask him some questions. By the time Detective Young got to the interrogation room late that night, his fatigue from 6 straight weeks of work had disappeared. For the detective, it was like flipping a switch. The second he launched an investigation, it was the only thing he cared about, and he could focus like a laser beam no matter how tired he was. Eric was already sitting in the interrogation room, and the detective quickly sized him up. The first thing he noticed was how big Eric was. Eric had played semi-professional rugby, and Young thought how easy it would be for him to overpower someone Amy's size. But the second thing Young noticed was that Eric seemed agitated, like someone who was afraid he was in trouble. And as Detective Young peppered Eric with questions, Eric's story began to sound pretty odd. He claimed that on the night Amy was missing, they were at the Pavilion Club, and then after the last call, which was sometime between 12:45 and 1 a.m., Eric went to the bathroom. But he got stuck in a long line, and then by the time he got out of the bathroom, Amy had taken off, leaving him alone. So he got in his car and he circled the block once to see if he could find her, but when Amy didn't turn up, he decided that she would just have to find her own way home, and he left. But what made this story so hard to believe was that according to Eric, Amy had left her wallet, cell phone, purse, and car keys in his car. Detective Young was about to ask Eric to explain this when someone knocked on the door. Young frowned, but he knew nobody would interrupt unless it was really important, so he excused himself and stepped out of the room. And once he had, an officer handed him a phone, and when Young put it to his ear, he heard his sergeant's voice. The sergeant said he was with 3 young men who had flagged down his patrol car to tell him they were with Amy the night she disappeared and they needed to talk to police right now. Detective Young told the sergeant to bring them in right away. But Detective Young had to get back to his interview with Eric, so he assigned other detectives to talk to the 3 young men and just report back to him. The 3 young men eventually arrived at the police station, and they introduced themselves to the detectives. They were Russ Gorman, Kush Sharma, and their other roommate. And obviously Russ and Kush were the 2 young men that Amy had played pool with on the night she went missing. And they would tell the detectives that recently a bartender had showed them the missing person poster of Amy, and they instantly recognized her as the woman they had played pool with, and so as soon as they saw it, they left the bar and flagged down the first patrol car they saw. Russ was a charming guy who had very stylized hair. He had frosted tips, which meant the ends of his hair, kind of all throughout his hair, were bleached blonde, and he gelled his hair up. And although he'd only been in Portland for 18 months, he was already a regular in the bar scene there. And he would tell the detective that he and his buddy Kush had been playing pool when Amy had come over and asked to join their game. And Russ would say that actually he and Amy hit it off right away, and he actually asked for her phone number. But Russ made it clear he did not expect this to go anywhere, because he watched as Amy literally went back to her date, and so Russ and Kush just left and went to another bar. But then the 2 men went to the Pavilion nightclub, where sure enough, they ran into Amy again. This was around the time that Amy had gone to the dance floor on her own. She saw Russ and Kush, and the 3 of them basically started dancing together. And so Russ would tell the detectives that the 3 of them just danced all night, and then after last call, Russ said he wanted to keep partying, so he invited Amy to come back to their apartment. He told her they were going to have an after-hours birthday party for their 3rd roommate, and he wanted Amy to join them. And so she agreed, and they all got to the apartment at around 1:15 a.m. But the birthday party never really materialized, and Russ could tell Amy was really bored, and so eventually he just asked Amy if she wanted a ride back home. And Amy actually said that she wanted a ride back to the Pavilion because then she could go find her date, Eric, and he could give her a ride home. And if for some reason she couldn't find him, her mom's house was right nearby and she could just walk there. So at about 2 a.m., Russ dropped off Amy right outside the Pavilion on the curb, and then after watching her head towards the Pavilion, Russ just drove home and stayed there for the rest of the night. And when detectives spoke to the other 2 roommates, they would tell basically the exact same version of the story. The detectives were excited. It sounded like Russ may have been the last person to see Amy alive, and so they rushed to tell Detective Young what they had learned. Detective Young was still talking to Eric when the detectives knocked again on their door. And when Young stepped out and they told him what Russ and the roommate said, a new theory popped up in Detective Young's head. He wondered if maybe Eric saw Amy get dropped off by some other guy, and maybe that sent him into a jealous rage. But when Detective Young walked back into the interview room and sat down, he said nothing to Eric about what he had just learned. Instead, he asked Eric to go over all of his actions after Amy had left the club without him. Young wanted to see if he could maybe catch Eric in a lie. Eric claimed that after he realized Amy was gone, he just drove himself back to Amy's house and then let himself inside using Amy's key. But when he didn't find Amy inside, he said he felt weird about staying in her house all alone, so he slept outside in his car. The next morning, Eric said he left his car and went back inside of Amy's house to use her shower and also to drop off all her belongings she had left in his car, and then afterwards he said he did leave an angry note pinned to her apartment door, and then he left her coat outside right on the hood of her car, and he dropped her keys onto one of her tires. And that was the end of his weekend. When Eric stopped talking, Detective Young couldn't help but feel like this guy's story just seemed totally off. And soon he would have yet another interruption that would confirm his suspicion. Suddenly, another detective called Young out of the interview room to tell him that Amy's neighbor had called her local police department on Sunday with her own concerns about Amy's safety. She'd seen Amy's expensive coat on the ground beside her car on Sunday morning, so she had knocked on Amy's door to see if she was okay. But it wasn't just the coat that made the neighbors nervous. On Friday night, the neighbor had seen Eric angrily peeling out of Amy's driveway, and when the neighbor actually asked Amy what was going on, Amy said Eric was furious with her because Amy didn't want to have sex with him. So when this neighbor saw the coat on Sunday morning, and then she knocked on Amy's door and Amy didn't answer, this neighbor went and got Amy's keys from the landlord, and when she went inside and realized it was empty, she called the police. Detective Young had never in his life had so many witnesses volunteer to help out on a case, and every single witness story really seemed to point the finger at Eric. And it was easy to imagine Eric being mad after driving all the way to Maine from Florida only to be rejected, and the neighbor's story was especially damning for Eric, because it meant that Eric was already enraged that Amy wouldn't sleep with him the day before Amy had left him for two other guys at the pavilion. And Detective Young thought Eric's story about driving to Amy's house and sleeping in his car on a night when the weather was in the low 40s, so nearly freezing outside, was nonsense. But when Young went back in to question Eric about all of this, Eric did something very unexpected. He said he had proof that he drove to Amy's apartment late on the night she disappeared. Then he pulled out a receipt from a gas station, which was located on the way to Amy's apartment. And Eric told Detective Young that if this receipt wasn't enough, he also had a witness. On his drive to Amy's, he had to pass through a toll, but he didn't have any money. And the toll taker had basically taken pity on him and let him through anyway, and so as a result of that, Eric was confident she would remember him. By now, Detective Young's head was spinning. This was the most chaotic interview he had ever conducted. Usually, investigators had to hunt for tips, but tonight they were pouring in too fast for him to even keep up with. The detective felt like Eric really was his best suspect, but Russ had been the last person to see Amy alive, so he couldn't be ruled out yet. But this actually wasn't even the biggest question that Detective Young faced, because Amy's disappearance actually wasn't officially a criminal case at all. Amy was an adult, and she had only been gone for 2 days. Her friends and family were obviously worried, but as of now, there was no evidence that any crime had even been committed. Amy might actually be just fine. Some of the other detectives thought Detective Young was kind of overreacting. They thought Amy was going to waltz in any minute, wondering what all the fuss was about. The next morning, so 3 days after Amy disappeared, police went to her apartment to go look around. They found the key to her apartment sitting on the tire of her car, exactly the way Eric had described. But when they found Eric's angry note he had left inside, they discovered that it was much nastier than Eric had said it was. In the letter, Eric asked Amy very angrily where she'd gone, with a choice curse word thrown in. It was very clear Eric must have left feeling very mad, chucking Amy's coat as he left. When they searched Amy's apartment, the police took her computer, her mail, her answering machine, and even her diary. And as they flipped through the pages of her diary, they found pages of Amy's deepest thoughts, her struggles, her fears, and her hopes. But there was one name that kept coming up over and over again in this diary. It was Amy's ex, Richard Sparrow. In fact, she'd started this diary the day after she had broken up with him. So that day, the police picked Richard up at his house, they drove him to the station, and they put him in the same interrogation room where Detective Young had just questioned Eric the night before. And when Richard told the detective that he had slept over at Amy's place on the first night that Eric was visiting, Young felt his heart start to race. It was hard to imagine a more awkward or potentially explosive arrangement than having an ex-boyfriend sleeping on the couch while Amy's new man slept in the guest room. It was the type of situation where you could understand one or both of these men getting really mad. But Richard would tell Detective Young that truly he was on friendly terms with Amy and that he had only stayed in her apartment on Friday as a favor to her after she begged him to. And also, on the night that Amy disappeared, Richard said he went out in South Berwick with friends and then went home, an account that Richard's roommates all confirmed, which meant he was very likely many miles away from Portland when Amy went missing. So this interview with Richard really had Detective Young turn his sights back towards Eric and Russ, the two men who were chasing Amy on the night she vanished. As the days went by with no word on the whereabouts of their daughter, Amy's parents became increasingly desperate. On Thursday, October 25th, almost a week after Amy disappeared, her mother Diane went to the media and offered a $35,000 reward for information that would lead to Amy's safe return. And by now, Amy's case was no longer an off-the-books investigation by Detective Young. This was now a full-scale police operation. As a reminder to himself of just what was at stake, Detective Young put a photo of Amy on his desk. By now, Detective Young was pretty sure he knew which one was responsible for Amy's disappearance, but he couldn't prove it. So for now, he was just going to treat Eric and Russ like equal suspects. When Young had checked both men's backgrounds, he'd found they both had criminal records. Russ was on probation for theft, and the night he gave Amy a ride, he was driving with a suspended license, and facing the prospect of having his license revoked entirely. Eric had some minor drug offenses on his record, but more alarming was his ex-girlfriend in Florida had a restraining order against him. Weirdly, her name was also Amy, and she even kind of looked like Amy St. Laurent. Police had begun a much more aggressive search for Amy. Sheriff's deputies retraced Eric's route from the nightclub back to Amy's apartment, checking anywhere that somebody might be able to hide a body, but they found nothing. Police in surrounding communities looked through abandoned buildings, and they searched the train tracks and highways and the edges of the harbor. National Guard helicopters searched from above, and detectives even spent their own time looking for Amy on weekends. But no one could find any trace of Amy. Meanwhile, both primary suspects left town. Eric went back to Florida where he lived and worked, while Russ went to Alabama since he had family there. Usually, Detective Young would want to keep his suspects close, but in this case, he was actually happy that both men had left. He figured the killer might relax once he was away from Portland, and maybe he might confess something to somebody close to him. 5 weeks later, there was still no sign of Amy, and everyone at this point feared she was dead. Officers who had initially been skeptical that Amy was even in trouble were now drawn into the case out of real concern for the young woman. They'd learned so much about Amy during the investigation, not just the details of the last few days before she vanished, but the details of her life, how kind she was and how spontaneously generous. One couple told police that Amy gave them money out of her savings one Christmas when they didn't have money to buy presents for their kid. Another friend told police that Amy one time had paid for a plane ticket so the friend could fly home to celebrate her parents' 50th wedding anniversary. Amy even took a leave of absence from work to stay at a friend's bedside when they were in a coma in the hospital. Some of the officers began referring to Amy as, quote, our Amy, almost like they were her father. Detective Young found himself constantly looking at that photo of Amy he kept on his desk, and whenever he looked at her, he felt like she was looking back at him, pleading with him to help her. And as time dragged on without any breakthrough, people in Portland began getting scared that a killer was literally on the loose among them. And you gotta remember that this was around the time right after 9/11, so Americans at this time were very much on edge. And now Amy's disappearance had only made the paranoia much worse for people in Portland. As the lead detective in the hunt for Amy, Detective Young felt like so far he was letting the public down, especially her family. But he didn't really know what else to do. Without a body, he had no crime scene and no evidence, and so he was totally stalled. And that's when Detective Young got an unusual offer. A lieutenant from the Maine Warden Service named Pat Dorian thought he might be able to help find Amy. Every year, Dorian and his team found over 300 lost hikers, mostly people who got turned around inside of Maine's vast forests. Even though they'd never looked for a dead body before, the lieutenant thought the wardens might be able to apply their expertise to this case. Detective Young wasn't sure that a bunch of game wardens could help, but winter was coming, and once there was snow on the ground, finding a body would be much more difficult, if not impossible. So Detective Young told the lieutenant that yes, he would like his help. So on Monday, December 3rd, which was 6 weeks after Amy had vanished, Detective Young squeezed into a crowded conference room at the police station and took a seat at the conference table. Detective Young's team sat on one side and Lieutenant Dorian's on the other, all of them looking over a table full of equipment, computers, and mapping programs. Detective Young began by showing the wardens all the places the police had already searched. But Dorian really wanted to know more about the suspects, so his team could get a better sense of where either man might go to dispose of a body. So Dorian asked questions like, how familiar were they with the woods and the outdoors? And were they the kind of people who would feel comfortable hiking into an unfamiliar area? Detective Young decided he would just focus on the one suspect he was pretty sure was responsible for Amy's disappearance, which by this point he fully expected was a murder. It was a gamble what he was doing, but in his experience, Young had seen that the more focused a search is, the better the results. So for hours, the people at this table, Dorian, Young, their teams, discussed every detail of the case, and about the one suspect that he was focusing on. But a question from the wardens caught the detectives by surprise. Did their suspect have access to a shovel? And surprisingly, despite all their interviews and questions, none of the detectives had any idea. So immediately after the meeting, Detective Young asked other investigators to find out whether the suspect had a shovel. And right away, word came back that the suspect did have a shovel, and in fact, he had borrowed the shovel recently. 5 days later, at 6:30 a.m. on December 8, 2001, a new, massive search for Amy began. 100 officers and 45 Maine search and rescue volunteers fanned out across southern Maine, along with cadaver dogs that are trained to smell dead bodies. But after hours of searching, the team found nothing. The cadaver dogs indicated that they smelled something a few times, but it turned out to just be nothing but dead animals. Then, around 1 p.m., searchers turned down a side road off the highway that had been used to haul gravel to expand the road. At the end were trails that led off into the brush and some debris from the construction. With snow closing in, the searchers spread out in a line shoulder to shoulder and marched into the woods just as they had at other potential burial spots. And after about 30 minutes of this, one of the searchers ducked under a branch and they came upon a spot where the earth seemed to have been pressed down and kind of smoothed over. So the searchers brought over the dogs, and right away the dogs were barking and pointing at that spot on the ground. Searchers immediately yelled out for Detective Young to come over, and when he did come over and he looked down at the spot, he could see there were some pine needles that had been thrown over this area, almost like to disguise it, and so it seemed very likely this was a burial spot. And sure enough, when searchers got their shovels and began digging in that spot, they would uncover Amy's badly decomposed body. The next day, Sunday, December 9th, the medical examiner conducted Amy's autopsy. And from this autopsy, it was clear that Amy had been beaten and shot. But there wasn't much other physical evidence to go on. There were no fingerprints or DNA from the killer on the body. In fact, her body was so decomposed that the medical examiner needed Amy's dental records just to confirm it was really her. 5 days later, on Friday, December 14th, Amy's family held a memorial for her at a funeral home in South Portland. 25 white candles surrounded a photo of Amy, one for every year of her life. Beside the memorial sat a bouquet of pink roses, just like the flowers that her father would give her every year for her birthday. Detective Young would have loved to be at Amy's service, but he couldn't go because at that very moment, he was in his car driving south on his way to pick up the killer. Even though the killer had left the state, detectives had kept a close eye on him. And when Amy's body was found, they finally got their break, because the killer had believed police would never find the body, and so when they did, the killer panicked. He called someone and he confessed to the crime. Finally, all the pieces fell together, and for the first time, Detective Young knew what really happened to Amy. In the early morning hours of Sunday, October 21st, the killer asked Amy if she wanted a ride home. At least that's what he told her he was going to do, because in reality, the killer had other plans in mind. When Amy got in the car, the killer kept staring at her. He thought she was absolutely stunning, and he was sure that if he could just make the right move, something might happen romantically between them. So he turned on the radio, found a good song, and began to drive. Eventually, the killer got onto the highway, at which point Amy told him he was going the wrong way. The killer told her that he was just going to take her for a moonlit walk. It was going to be great. But Amy said she had no interest in that and just wanted to be taken home. But the killer wasn't prepared to do that. So he pulled off the highway to a secluded spot, and he turned to Amy and said, "Please, just give me a chance." Then he told her how pretty she was and how attracted he was to her, hoping this might make her want to stay out longer with him, but it only made her more agitated, and she eventually demanded to be taken home right now. And at first, the killer did begin driving back on the highway as if he was going to take her home, but then he turned down a side road, at which point Amy began screaming at him to turn around and bring me home right now. The killer could feel anger boiling up inside of him to the point where he just couldn't control it anymore. So he pulled the car over on the side of the road, he put it in park, and then he turned and just wound up and punched Amy. Stunned, Amy leapt out of the car and just began running. But the killer had more than just fists to hurt Amy with. He grabbed a gun from under the seat and then ran out after her. And when he caught up to her, he couldn't contain his anger. He hit her again across the face with the gun, splitting her lip and chipping her tooth. Then he hit her for a third time, this time hard enough to break a bone in her face. Amy tried to fight back, but her killer was much stronger, and he knocked her to the ground and pinned her down. They struggled for a while, and at some point the killer tore at Amy's clothes and sexually assaulted her, and then when he was done, he grabbed his gun again. He knew if he were to let Amy go, he'd get in big trouble. So instead, he put that gun to the right side of Amy's head, and he pulled the trigger. The killer knew he needed to hide the body now, but he knew he couldn't do much in the dark, so he dragged her body into the nearby forest where she was out of sight, and then he left her for the night. And then the next day, he returned with a shovel and he buried her. Even before Amy's body was found, Detective Young had already begun to suspect one person much more than anybody else. Detectives actually managed to find surveillance video of Eric at a gas station alone at 1:36 a.m. on the night Amy went missing, just as Eric had claimed. They also found the turnpike toll taker who remembered taking pity on Eric when he couldn't pay the toll. And so with all that corroboration, police didn't think it was possible for Eric to have returned to Portland to pick up Amy by 2 a.m., the time Russ said he had dropped her off. But police had a harder time verifying Russ's claim that he had driven Amy from his apartment to the Portland nightclub and then returned home in just 25 minutes. Russ's roommates had vouched for him, but their stories didn't hold up. His roommate claimed he knew Russ came in around 2:25 a.m. because he was in the middle of writing an email to his aunt when Russ walked in. But when police looked through his emails, there was no record that he actually sent any email to his aunt. And police could not find a single person who actually saw Russ drop off Amy at the pavilion. Instead, police found evidence that Russ was lying. He got pulled over by police on the night that Amy went missing at around 3:14 a.m. for not dimming his high beam lights. So clearly he hadn't come home quickly and then stayed home like he had claimed, because here he was out and about at 3:14. Then, after Amy disappeared, police found that Russ had borrowed a shovel from his mom's boyfriend, and the location of her body where she was buried, it was found less than 4/10 of a mile from Russ's mother's house. And in addition to all that evidence, Russ actually just confessed the entire crime to his mother after news broke that Amy's body had been found. On Monday, June 30th, 2003, Russ Gorman was convicted of killing Amy and sentenced to 60 years in prison. 18-year-old Aaron Blocker shifted uncomfortably in his seat. It was January 2011, and the Mississippi College freshman was doing his best to pay attention in his chemistry class. Chemistry was usually Aaron's favorite class. He dreamed of being a scientist himself. But today, he was distracted. His stomach was cramping, and he really had to go to the bathroom. Aaron had Crohn's disease, an illness that causes stomach cramps, severe weight loss, and diarrhea. He'd been diagnosed the year before, but for the past few weeks, he'd been suffering from a prolonged flare-up. Already this morning, Aaron had left the lecture hall 3 times to go to the restroom. Aaron tried to ignore all the twisting and churning that was going on in his stomach and just listen to the lecture, but pretty soon Aaron realized he couldn't ignore it any longer. So, like he already had 3 other times so far this morning, he quietly got up and began heading for the door again. But as Aaron climbed the stairs that led out of the lecture hall, he tripped over a backpack and nearly fell. Now, immediately, Aaron heard people laughing at him in the classroom, but that didn't really bother him, because all Aaron was thinking is, thank goodness that was not worse. Aaron had always been a bit uncoordinated, and he did fall kind of a lot, and unfortunately, he was very prone to breaking bones from even the mildest of impacts. As a child, he had managed to break his nose, his fingers, and his wrist, and he had also dislocated several joints. Thankfully, though, on this day, Aaron did reach the doors of the lecture hall in one piece, and then once Aaron was out the doors, he hustled his way down the hall towards the bathroom. 2 nights later, Aaron sat in the college cafeteria across from his girlfriend, Emily, who he had been dating for nearly a year. Aaron was a grade ahead of Emily, so she was actually still in high school. She was a senior. But his college was not far from her home, and so she came to visit him whenever she could. Emily had just gotten her first tattoo, and she was telling Aaron all about the experience, but Aaron was having a really hard time focusing on her story. The distinctive sort of greasy aroma of sloppy joes and tater tots filled the busy dining hall, and it was making Aaron feel really nauseous. He was on a restrictive diet because of his Crohn's disease, and the cafeteria's very greasy food was brutal on his stomach. But his dorm didn't have a kitchen, so he really had no other choice but to try to eat as much as he could handle. As he tried to force down some food, his stomach suddenly spasmed and Aaron clutched his belly in pain. Emily saw this and stopped her story and asked if he was okay, but Aaron sort of brushed it off. He said he was used to the pain and told her not to worry. But this time, the pain was just too much, and Aaron doubled over in agony as another spasm cut through his gut. Emily shot up from her chair and put her arm around him, and then whispered to him that he really needed to go see a doctor. And Aaron nodded and told her that, his abdominal pains had been getting worse and worse for days. And so Emily gathered up all their things and then called a taxi to take them to the nearest hospital. A couple of hours later, Aaron laid in a hospital bed in the emergency room with Emily sitting by his side. The doctor had ordered an immediate CT scan of Aaron's abdomen, and so now they were just waiting for the results. Aaron clutched Emily's hand and let out a deep breath. He was, unfortunately, quite used to hospitals, doctors, needles, and machines. And in virtue of being Aaron's girlfriend, Emily, too, was very accustomed to this environment. Aaron was very grateful to have his girlfriend by his side. And so he looked up at Emily, and he told her he just could not imagine going through all this stuff by himself. But before she could reply, the ER doctor came into the room with Aaron's test results. And the doctor got straight to the point and said he'd found something very troubling in Aaron's CT scan. But it was actually not Aaron's gut that was concerning the doctor. He said during the CT scan, as they're trying to photograph his abdomen, the scan had kind of inadvertently caught a bit of Aaron's hip bones. And basically, the bones showed signs that they were dying. It's a condition called avascular necrosis, which happens when blood supply to a bone is cut off, and so the tissue decays. Aaron closed his eyes and grimaced. He wondered if maybe this condition he'd never even heard of might explain his history of so many broken bones. Aaron quickly filled the doctor in about his medical history and how doctors had really struggled to figure out why his bones always seemed so brittle. Throughout his childhood and teenage years, Aaron had been tested for various conditions, from common issues like arthritis to a rare genetic condition called Wilson's disease. But each time, the results were either negative or inconclusive. It wasn't until Aaron was diagnosed with Crohn's disease a year ago that Aaron finally got an answer that sort of made sense. His doctor had told him that because his Crohn's disease had been untreated for so long, Aaron had been malnourished, and as a result, his bones were weakened. But that was a year ago, and since then, Aaron had done everything in his power to eat right and build up his strength, and so it just seemed like, he would have been doing better by now. The ER doctor listened closely and took a bunch of notes. Then, after Aaron was done speaking, the doctor asked him if he was taking any new medications. And Aaron nodded and said that yes, for the past 8 weeks, he'd been taking low doses of a steroid called prednisone to help reduce the inflammation caused by Crohn's disease. Aaron could see from the ER doctor's expression that he was puzzled. The doctor said that steroids could cause bone damage like this, but only with prolonged use and high doses. In his opinion, 8 weeks was just not enough time to cause this much damage to Aaron's hips. But just to be safe, the ER doctor recommended that Aaron go see the other doctor who'd prescribed him this steroid to see if maybe they could change his treatment plan. Aaron's mind was swirling. He had convinced himself that if he could just get his Crohn's disease under control, he could live a normal college student life. But now here he was being told he had an even bigger problem with no clear solution. And so Aaron shook his head in disbelief. But at the same time, he tried to stay positive. He hoped that if he stopped taking steroids, his bones would stop breaking down and he would get better. 2 years later, on a muggy summer day, Aaron clutched the sticky vinyl seat of a campus shuttle bus. Every time the bus hit even the smallest of bumps, Aaron would feel pain shooting through his hips. Aaron was now 20 years old and working hard towards his degree in biology and medical sciences. It was fascinating to him to learn how the human body worked. He hoped that someday he'd know enough to understand what was happening to him. Because Aaron was still in constant pain. His weakened hips made it really hard for him to walk around campus, so he took the shuttle bus as often as he could, even though it was quite painful. Right after visiting the emergency room 2 years earlier, Aaron had stopped taking steroids, but that hadn't helped, and his hips had only gotten worse. At this rate, Aaron knew he could be facing a hip replacement surgery before he even turned 30 years old. When the shuttle bus came to a stop, Aaron carefully climbed down the steps and limped into the lobby of the school's medical building for an appointment with his orthopedist. He sighed as he shuffled his way into the very familiar waiting room. Doctors and nurses and hospitals were now as much a part of Aaron's life as college professors. A few minutes later, Aaron hobbled into an exam room and climbed up onto the crisp white paper covering the examination table. When the doctor arrived, he asked Aaron to lie down, but Aaron was in so much pain, the doctor had to actually help him lie down. After poking and prodding Aaron and also guiding Aaron's legs through several movements to check his range of motion, the doctor stepped back and grabbed Aaron's latest scans and began looking them over. And as he did, Aaron could tell he was very likely about to hear some bad news. He had seen that same concerned look on many doctors' faces in the past. Finally, the orthopedist lowered the paperwork and told Aaron that his avascular necrosis in his hip bones had continued to worsen and it was leaving behind a lot of dead bone tissue. And so he wanted Aaron to consider a surgery called core decompression to remove the diseased bone in Aaron's hips. Once the dead bone was gone, new blood vessels could develop and healthy bone could grow back. Ideally, this procedure would reduce Aaron's pain and help him avoid total hip replacement surgery down the road. Aaron was so desperate to feel better that he only had one question. How soon could they schedule this surgery? 8 weeks later, Aaron was at home in his small off-campus apartment, studying in bed. He hadn't been able to move much since his surgery, and he was irritable at how slow his recovery had been. He was having trouble focusing on the biology textbook he was reading, so he put it down and reached for the TV remote. But when he clicked the power button, the TV wouldn't turn on. Aaron wondered if maybe the remote's batteries were dead, so he carefully swung his legs over the side of the bed, grabbed onto his headboard, and pulled himself upright. Then Aaron grabbed the aluminum walker right next to his bed that he needed just to get around, and he inched his way across the room to his desk. He pulled 2 AA batteries out of the desk, but then he dropped one of the batteries as well as the back of the TV remote onto the floor. And Aaron suddenly thought to himself, what is he going to do? Getting down on the floor on his hands and knees was just totally out of the question. It would not only be very painful, but he also might not be able to stand up again. And so Aaron just suddenly felt overwhelmed by how much pain he was in, how inconvenient his life now was, and also just the fact that 2 months after surgery, it just did not feel like he was getting any better. But just then, Aaron heard the key in the front door, and a moment later, his girlfriend Emily called out his name. Aaron was so relieved that she was there. He yelled that he was in his bedroom and he could really use some help. Emily came into the room, and she could see that Aaron was very distraught. She helped him back into his bed and then reached under the dresser to retrieve the battery and the back of the remote. Emily suggested that Aaron just close his eyes for a half hour and she'd make him some lunch. Aaron smiled and felt so thankful to have Emily in his life, and then he did close his eyes. But Aaron was too anxious about his situation to fall asleep. It felt like his life's goals were slipping away from him. Aaron had to take time off of school after the surgery, and he didn't want to delay getting his degree any longer. And so he really just had to find a way to get better soon, or else the future that he longed for with Emily just wouldn't be able to exist. One month later, a nurse at the orthopedist's office led Aaron into an exam room and closed the door behind them. Aaron attempted to climb the tiny step stool in front of the examination table like he had done so many times in the past, but this time the pain in his hips was so extreme he just couldn't do it, so he opted for a chair instead. A minute later, Aaron heard a soft knock on the door and his orthopedist came in. The doctor pulled up a stool in front of the room's computer monitor so they could look at the results of Aaron's latest CT scans. Once the doctor had pulled up the images, he pointed to the balls in both of Aaron's hip sockets, and then he pulled up another image of a healthy hip joint to compare. The doctor said that on the healthy hip, the ball and socket looked like a smooth, round sphere surrounded by space. But on Aaron's hips, the balls looked broken down and fractured. The joints were surrounded by white shadows that represented scar tissue that had grown and grown over the years. This was obviously not what the doctor or Aaron had hoped for. The bones in his hips were grinding together and continuing to break down, which meant the core decompression surgery was a failure. Aaron asked the doctor why his bones kept decaying no matter what doctors recommended, and the doctor admitted he simply didn't know. The doctor said the next step would be a double hip replacement surgery. But he assured Aaron that although it was unusual to replace hips in someone so young as Aaron, it was a common surgery with great results. And so he told Aaron that after his surgery, he would very likely be able to walk easily again and his pain would be gone. But despite that, this was still a very difficult decision for Aaron. If he went through with the hip replacement surgery, he would need up to a year of recovery and rehab, which would mean putting his schoolwork on hold again when he was so looking forward to graduation and doing scientific or biomedical research in the real world. And so this was going to be a really challenging decision. But then Aaron stood up to go get his jacket, and his hips hurt so much just walking the 3 feet to the coat hanger, Aaron realized he really had no choice here. The pain was so bad and it was only getting worse, and so he basically had to do the hip replacement surgery. 4 years later, in 2016, the clock radio on Aaron's nightstand belted out a pop song, jolting him awake. Aaron rolled over and hit the snooze button, and as he did, he smiled. Before his hip replacement 4 years ago, rolling over would have been so painful, but now he was moving just fine. It had taken a long time to become this healthy again. Following the hip replacement surgery, Aaron had to stop going in person to school and take online classes in order to finish his degree on time. He spent his time mostly indoors and bedridden, but slowly he had regained his mobility and had gotten his life back on track. Aaron had graduated from college and was now pursuing a master's degree in biomedical research at Mississippi College. At the age of 24, 4 years after the surgeries, Aaron was finally focusing on his future rather than his pain. Through it all, Emily had stayed by his side, like always. And at the end of 2012, Aaron asked her to marry him, and to his delight, she had said yes. They were married on August 1st, 2013, the best day of Aaron's life. Aaron could hear Emily in the kitchen cooking up some breakfast. A moment later, she called to him and asked if he wanted some eggs. Aaron yelled back that he'd be right there as he put his slippers on. Just then, Aaron's alarm clock went off again, and without thinking, Aaron twisted around to stop it. And as he did, he suddenly felt an excruciating pain in his left hip. The worst pain he had ever felt in his entire life. Aaron instantly writhed in pain and fell back on the bed and shouted for Emily. She rushed into the bedroom and tried to help Aaron stand, but he couldn't move his left leg at all because the pain was now totally unbearable. And so through gritted teeth, he asked Emily to hand him his phone, and when she did, Aaron called a friend, and a few minutes later, that friend arrived, and together with Emily, they helped lift Aaron up and carried him out to the car so they could drive him to the hospital. An hour later, Aaron lay on a gurney staring up at the hospital ceiling lights flashing past him as the ER staff whisked him down a hospital corridor to the CT scan room. Aaron had hoped that these emergency visits were behind him, but here he was again amidst the smell of disinfectant, the high-pitched sounds of equipment, and very sick people just like him. In the scan room, technicians helped move Aaron's aching body to the motorized table, making Aaron groan every time they touched him. As the table began to move, Aaron could hear buzzing and whirring noises as the machinery took images of his hips and midsection. Even lying there was painful, because Aaron had to clench his muscles to keep his legs perfectly still. Once the scan was over, Aaron clenched his teeth in pain as the technicians shifted him back onto the gurney and then wheeled him back to a waiting room. And after an agonizing hour of waiting, a doctor finally came in the room to go over the results. As the ER doctor pulled up Aaron's files on the room's computer, Aaron filled him in on his history with Crohn's disease, a vascular necrosis, and hip replacements. Aaron was so accustomed to recounting his medical history that it now came out like a well-rehearsed presentation. The doctor turned the computer monitor towards Aaron and told him that based on the scan, his hip implant had popped out of the socket and shifted into the wrong place. So the dislocated hip would have to be adjusted manually, a procedure the doctor warned would hurt, but only for a moment. The doctor asked Aaron if he was ready for the adjustment, and Aaron just sort of nodded and said okay. Then a second doctor came in to help with the procedure. Together, these doctors all around the bed forcefully pushed Aaron's hip back into place. And true to their word, it was a split second of agonizing pain, but it quickly dissipated, and Aaron felt much better. He asked the doctor what was next, and he got a familiar answer. Go back to your orthopedic surgeon for a follow-up. Several days later, Aaron sat inside the usual exam room at his orthopedist's office. The doctor examined Aaron's CT scans in silence for a minute, and then finally he spoke, and Aaron felt his heart sink. The doctor said that even though they had successfully popped the hip back into place, that didn't solve the underlying problem. Aaron's left hip implant had become loose because the bone around it was still decaying, and it was now only a matter of time until the same thing happened with his other leg. As a result, his hip implants were now too small to properly fit inside of their sockets. Aaron was shocked. How could this have happened? He'd followed all his doctor's instructions for years throughout his multiple recoveries and rehabs. He was very careful with his hips and he stayed away from really strenuous activities. And yet, he'd still dislocated his hip just from getting out of bed. It felt like all the progress he'd made was kind of for nothing. Aaron wondered what he could even do at this point to ease his pain. The orthopedic surgeon told Aaron that he couldn't really explain why Aaron's hips were in such bad shape, but he could tell him what should be done to respond. The only remedy he could suggest for now was to remove the damaged old implants and replace them again with larger ones. Aaron left the doctor's office in silence and headed for the parking lot. Then, alone, inside of his car, Aaron burst into tears. He just didn't know how much longer he could keep going like this. By the time Aaron got home, his despair had morphed into anger. He had already endured 11 serious surgeries and more broken bones than he could count, and he was only 24 years old. He'd seen a parade of doctors, and none of them had come remotely close to figuring out what was actually wrong with him. Even if he got another hip replacement, Aaron knew it was only a matter of time until he would have to do it again and again and again if his bones continued to decay. Aaron wondered if maybe he would just spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair. Just then, Emily got home from work, and when Aaron saw her, he went from being mad back to being sad all over again, and he broke down and just started crying. Emily tried to comfort him, but Aaron was inconsolable. So Emily just kind of let Aaron vent, and then once he was done crying and kind of talking about what was going on, she asked him to come keep her company in the kitchen while she made them dinner. Aaron smiled at her and then slowly eased himself into a chair at the kitchen table while Emily poured them each some wine. A few minutes later, Aaron had calmed down and he was thinking clearly, and he told Emily that too many elements of his medical story just didn't add up. Why would his hip implants fail after 4 years when they were supposed to last 20 years? Why didn't any of the other surgeries work? What was actually going on with his bones? If he was going to subject himself to yet another hip surgery, Aaron wanted to make sure he'd exhausted all other options first. But at this point, Aaron didn't trust any doctor to figure it out for him. So if he was going to find a solution, he felt like he would need to do it himself. Several weeks later, Aaron sat in bed with his laptop resting on his lap. Next to him, Emily was quietly reading a book. Aaron had compiled just about all of his medical records dating back to when he was a child, and finally, thanks to his years of studies, he could actually understand what they all meant. When he looked at all of his records together, Aaron found patterns that did make sense for a person suffering from Crohn's disease. But so far, nothing he was seeing could explain his weakened bones. Then, all of a sudden, Aaron sat up straight with a huge smile on his face. Emily noticed and put her book down and asked what was going on. And he showed her a series of his medical records going back a decade, all indicating severely low levels of an enzyme he'd only heard of once before, called alkaline phosphatase. Back in 2010, when Aaron was a junior in high school, one of his doctors had noticed he had low levels of this enzyme, which was why Aaron had been tested for the genetic condition called Wilson's disease. Now, Aaron did not think much of this at the time, since the results were inconclusive, and no one had ever mentioned the enzyme again. But as Aaron dove deeper into his medical records, he noticed the low levels of the enzyme in 2011 as well, and 2012, and 2013. In fact, every year since 2010, his blood tests indicated low levels of alkaline phosphatase. Emily and Aaron looked at each other. What was this enzyme, and what did having low levels of it mean? They wondered if maybe it was the key to understanding what was going wrong with Aaron's body. Emily looked on hopefully as Aaron typed in, "What is alkaline phosphatase?" into an online search engine. The first result he got back was for a website dedicated to an ultra-rare disease with a long name Aaron had never heard of. Aaron clicked on it, and then immediately after reading just a couple of sentences, he looked at Emily with a big smile on his face. All of his symptoms matched up with what he was reading. Aaron had no doubt he had just found what he was looking for. A week later, Aaron sat across from his doctor, studying his face as the physician read over the printed out pages Aaron had brought for him. The doctor was unfamiliar with this very rare disease that Aaron had found online, but he agreed that it did make a lot of sense, and it could be directly caused by the low levels of alkaline phosphatase in his blood. Aaron suspected he had a condition called hypophosphatasia. It's an ultra-rare metabolic bone disease that affects the body's ability to make alkaline phosphatase, which helps bones stay healthy by absorbing essential minerals like calcium, phosphate, and magnesium. When there's a deficiency in alkaline phosphatase, the minerals don't get absorbed by the bone. Instead, these minerals collect on tendons, kidneys, and other organs and cause serious damage. In Aaron's case, they had collected on his hip bones. Aaron's doctor ordered immediate bone scans to test for hypophosphatasia, and a few days later, the bone scans confirmed Aaron's theory was right. Miraculously, Aaron solved his own lifelong health crisis. In 2018, 1 year after his successful diagnosis, Aaron started on enzyme replacement therapy, which is the only treatment known for hypophosphatasia. Aaron also had 9 more surgeries to undo damage that had already been done to his body. But since starting the enzyme replacement treatments, Aaron's bones have stopped decaying, and calcium deposits in other parts of his body have disappeared completely. As for his Crohn's disease, which actually had nothing to do with his bone condition, that is in remission. But to this day, Aaron still does deal with small levels of pain every single day. Aaron successfully finished his master's degree and started a family with his wife. Currently, he works as a data and analytics consultant for a hospital system, and is a prominent patient advocate for hypophosphatasia.
Oh, 0532. The phone vibrates. In a room still wrapped in darkness. One short message. Line 3 is down. No time to ask why. Only one thing matters. The clock has already started running.
A pretty view. Driving to your house. You say that we're over, whatever, and yet you're crying out my name until you fall asleep. You're my twilight silhouette. Turn out the sun, let's stay in bed. The deeper I fall, the higher I go. Your hesitation never so low. You say you're over it. Who do you think you're kidding?
From Ballen Studios and Wondery, this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, Mr. Ballen. A quick note about our stories: we use aliases sometimes because we don't know the names of the real people in the story, and also